Hey guys, what's new with you? Nothing big happening in my life. I guess I dyed my hair red. I mean, this isn't like a super secret since I kind of used my face on my thumbnail. Probably, I don't know. I haven't made it yet. Maybe I won't. Maybe this is a reveal. I don't know yet. I'm so tired. I can't even think right now. The reason for that is that I recently went on a 10-day road trip to DC and back with tons of stops along the way. And if you watch this channel, like at all, you might have guessed why I wanted to go to DC. A little bit. My partner, thank goodness, has a great sense of humor and also really loves museums and all that kind of stuff. So he was like, yeah, we'll do DC and we'll do stops up and around. So it was a whole thing, and we were gone for a bajillion days. It was 10. But after you've driven like several hundred miles, it starts to feel like a bajillion. And along the way, I just kept finding myself talking to him about books that I had read. And so I wanted to show off my hair and talk about my road trip a little bit because it was so much fun, and I thought this would be different for some content. So, hello, let's start. So we started off in New Haven, Connecticut, and our first stop was at the Yale Art Gallery. And this was a stop that we put on the road trip based on a recommendation of someone who had been there. And based on the recommendation and just the fact that it was on the way to our first hotel, we were like, yeah, sure, we'll just do that. And I didn't realize that there's like 4.5 floors to this place. It's absolutely huge. There are all kinds of different art. There are always special exhibits, and Yale and New Haven itself are just a gorgeous place to be. I don't read a lot of books that have to do specifically with art. So while we were there, there was some Rothkos and some really just like monochromatic, sharp lines, images that really had me thinking about this book that I read by Molly Bang called Picture This. Now, this is a book that explains the art of making a picture book, like a children's picture book, but it is one of the most amazing books on making art that I've ever read. When I started class for my master's degree that was all about picture books, I was like, what can there really be to talk about? And this is the book that, in simple language and really easy to understand examples, showed me how easy and how complicated and how nuanced, and it's all wrapped up in this, that it can be to do basic illustrations for picture books or other illustrations, but this is specifically picture books. So even if this is not maybe your wheelhouse, if you're interested in how art or illustration comes together, this is an incredible book. It's a really fast and easy read, and I still think about it like a lot because it was just so interesting. So after the art gallery, we went to a Six Flags in New Jersey, and this again was a kind of a stop that was hard to have a book for. But the first thing that my partner said when we got there was like, okay, we're gonna do all the roller coasters. Personally, I have nothing deeply against roller coasters, but when it comes to thrill rides, I normally need quite a bit of warm up. I hadn't been obviously to an amusement park in several years. I don't know the last time I was on a roller coaster, and I was like, I don't know if that's a good idea, but he was like, no, we should go. And we absolutely should have, because we went so early in the day and raced around to all of the big rides that for most of them we had almost no wait in line. So that was an incredible choice because by the middle of the day it was hot, sweaty, gross, and there were people everywhere. So thinking about this stop and thinking about thrill rides, I had to think of not necessarily the scariest book that I've ever read, but the most thrilling book I've ever read. And that is the only true crime book I've ever read that I have talked about before, and that is I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara. This is the story of the Golden State Killer and one woman's obsessive search to uncover his identity. I've talked about the book, I've talked about the HBO series. I'm not gonna do it ad nauseum again, but this book, despite being true crime, which is not a genre I read, is one of the best books I've ever read. period. Michelle McNamara's writing is incredible, the story is incredible, the mixing of the personal and the true crime aspect is it's just amazing. And if you had to read like one true crime book in your entire life, this would be the book that I tell you to read. So our third stop was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we had wanted to go see Constitution Hall, which is where they signed the Declaration of Independence, but we were not able to see that. The tickets were like way booked up out in advance. So we did see the Liberty Bell, because the Liberty Bell does not require a ticket. You just walk through and there's a little bit of a museum thing and then you see it and whatever. And then we had some time left to that day, and I had happened across this museum called the Museum of the American Revolution. This museum was incredible. One of the most amazing things that I didn't take a picture of because they don't let you is the fact that this museum has Washington's war tent. This is the actual American Revolution tent in which Washington spent most of the revolution, or the end of the revolution at least. I don't know what the turnover was for those canvas tents, but this was with him for several years during the revolution, and you get a small audiovisual presentation on it, and then you get to see it, and it's absolutely incredible. It was super cool. And the whole thing was very narrative. It's a very narrative storytelling, interactive, super cool museum. And I just kept telling my partner about Nathaniel Philbrick's American Revolution series. I have talked about these books previously in a supplementals episode because I read a couple of them, and they are without a doubt some of the most narrative and engaging nonfiction books I have ever read. And in 3 books you get really the entire story of the American Revolution, but it's a version of the American Revolution that to me felt very fresh. It brought out points or issues or events that I feel maybe sometimes aren't focused on as much in a more concise, perhaps, telling of the American Revolution. So I recommend that to people all the time who are interested in learning more about that, because it feels like you're reading fiction, but it's not. So that last stop in Philly brought us all the way to DC, the purpose of our visit. And in DC there were a couple of places that we went, some major places that made me think of some books. First thing I'm going to talk about though, not a book. So we went to the Smithsonian Zoo, and that always makes me think of Blackfish, the documentary that exposes the horrors of SeaWorld. I actually saw that in an indie theater when it first came out, and sometimes I still have nightmares about it. The Smithsonian Zoo is nothing like Blackfish. We were amazed by their care of the animals, the room that they give them, the thoughts into their happiness and conservation. So we just kept saying, oh, this is a good zoo. Because there are definitely some zoos that you go to and you're like, oh, this is really bad. So the Smithsonian Zoo is beautiful and wonderful. The animals even have places to go where they don't need to be around like people staring at them, which makes all the tourists upset. But for us was like, that's okay, Panda. I don't want to see you. You hang out in the closet where it's cool and people aren't staring at you, because I wouldn't want people to stare at me all day. So Blackfish is an incredible documentary. I believe it's on Netflix right now. That's always changing, so don't hold me to that. But yeah, be prepared for that. That is definitely, it's a heart burner for sure. We also went to the mall, obviously, and we appeared by the Washington Monument. And this was one of the first times that we were having a discussion about Washington, what Washington stands for, and what we know about him versus what we think we know about him. And I've talked about this book ad nauseum, but of course I also talked my partner's ear off, as like every time we had this conversation, about Alexis Coe's biography of George Washington called You Never Forget Your First. And the reason was because, and I told him this, I was like, if you read one of the books that I talk about this entire trip, please read this one, because it's not a dense biography by any means, but what it is an incredible think piece on how biographies are written and how specifically the legacy of George Washington has been written. So as we were like surrounded by monuments to his glory this entire visit, we were definitely thinking a lot about that. We also walked by the executive office building on our way to see the White House. And of course, if you know anything about me, immediately I was like, Nixon, because Nixon famously really didn't like the Oval Office and did a lot of his business, like the actual business of being president, in the EOB. I'm sure other presidents have done that as well. In fact, I know some of them have, but Nixon is famous for it because a lot of his Watergate tapes are recorded in his EOB hideaway office. So of course I had to bring up King Richard, An American Tragedy by Michael Dobbs, which is a book I just reviewed, and I know you're probably sick of it because it also came up in my mid-year book tag as one of my only 5-star books this year. It was so good, and it had recordings of the tapes, and I took that opportunity to gush about it again, and my boyfriend was like, please stop talking about Richard Nixon. So in the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, we were really struck by, in particular, it was kind of tucked away, but it was a hall on the evolution of humanity. And my partner does cognitive psychology or research psychology, and much of what he does focuses on how the brain works and how the brain evolves and just what brains do, really. And they had this section where they had skulls, and then they had a succession of phases of, human evolution. So as we were walking through there and talking about the pros and cons of different versions of Homo sapiens, as one does, or not Homo sapiens as the case may be, it really just made me think of Fantasyland by Kurt Anderson, which again I've talked about ad nauseum, but that book is really about how there is a very specific American sense of fantasy that we have built into our history from day one of us getting here, that has evolved and pervaded our entire lifestyle and the way that we think about the world. And I'm really trying to get him to read that book because I would be so interested on his take. So once again, just me talking about this book in the middle of the Smithsonian. So the day that we got to DC was the day that many of the Smithsonian museums announced that they were no longer doing time-ticketed entry, which was great because we got to add the portrait gallery to our stop. And I didn't know that I wanted to see this as much as I wanted to see this. And I took a picture with my boy Nixon as a joke. It's a joke. But that exists now. And my poor partner, as we're going through all the presidential photos, like I'm reading the little thing on the side and I'm like, I know more about this. And giving him anecdotes of things that I know. But what we really got interested in was the different presentation of the portraits as you move into the modern age and what each of those presidents was trying to capture with their portrait and if it's different or not. And that really made me think of one of my top 5 books of last year, John Dickerson's The Hardest Job in the World, The American Presidency. Because this book is a holistic look at the change and the construction of the presidency as we envision it, and what public needs and opinions and perceptions have turned that office into as the American Republic has gone along. Again, some of the things in the portrait gallery weren't their official portraits, but some of them were very artsy, and there's a huge contrast as you go through it from, the first portraits to the final ones. So really interesting, really glad we got to go. Again, that was probably my favorite day between the Natural History Museum and the portrait gallery because I wanted to see the Natural History Museum and I didn't know how much I wanted to see the portrait gallery. So that was super cool. So when we left DC, we detoured by Antietam, which is a Civil War battlefield in Maryland. It is the home of the bloodiest day of the Civil War, bloodiest single day, not bloodiest battle. We'll get to that in a second. So this national park is currently undergoing some renovation on its visitor center, which meant that we didn't get to see the museum portion, but it was free to take our car and drive around, which was super nice. I love free. It's a great price tag. One of the things that really caught our eye was this photo of Lincoln and McClellan that I personally had never seen. I'm not a huge Civil War buff, and so of course we started talking about Abraham Lincoln, and this conversation continued into our next stop, which I'll get to in a second. And it just made me think of Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, which is ostensibly a biography on Abraham Lincoln. But it is also an amazing look at Abraham Lincoln, the man, and how he took all of his presidential rivals and made them cabinet members, and how he worked through those personalities. And a lot of the Civil War, particularly with McClellan and some other commanders, is also Lincoln trying to juggle people's personalities. Like, just want to win a war here, why gotta be like this? So Antietam was incredible. They give you this walkthrough that you can go, and so you stop at a place and there's a video that plays that you can play on your phone that has a park ranger explaining it. I'm sure it wasn't as good as like the audio tour or whatever, but it was just really incredible to see and to ponder that incredible loss of life that took place on those fields, which when we went just looked gorgeous. So you're looking at a field and going, oh wow, this is so pretty, and then thinking about like the 30,000 people that died there. So it was very jarring and good prelude to our next stop, which was the Civil War battlefield at Gettysburg, which is far more famous. I think it's one of the most, if not the most famous Civil War battlefield ever. And I'm not going to talk about books for this one for a second, because I'm going to follow that up at the end, because our time at Gettysburg made me realize what I didn't know. And so I've got like a little bit of a TBR to share with you at the end. So after Gettysburg, we went to Harrisburg, which is the capital of Pennsylvania, and we went to the National Civil War Museum, and that was really cool to see after Antietam and Gettysburg, because after focusing a lot on those battles, the National Civil War Museum puts it all in context, right? Like, here's the whole scope of the war, the whole scope of all the campaigns, all the battles that were fought, and where these individual moments were in them, and that was super cool. It's also, for whatever reason, really hard for me to think of the Civil War without thinking of Ulysses S. Grant, but of course he's not really involved in Antietam and Gettysburg, so he's on the periphery of some of those museums, but he's not really in it. But here I just went ham on Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses S. Grant, which is one of the best presidential biographies I've read during this entire challenge. It was so engaging, it was so good, and so detailed. I loved it so much, and so of course my partner had to hear all about that. So returning to Gettysburg, while we were there, it was really weird because I have been to that battlefield before, actually, like 10-ish years ago. And when we were there, it was this incredible experience. It was November, it was very foggy, it was very misty, and we took the version of the tour where my dad had like a Civil War historian from Gettysburg who drives your car and tells you the entire story of Gettysburg in like a personal tour. Especially when he was describing the wheat field, which is a field on Gettysburg. It's a small wheat field, and it changes hands 3 or 4 times during like a 4-hour-ish period or something like that. Timing doesn't matter, to be honest. It's a continuous battle where the line is constantly moving, and these people are walking over bodies and not quite dead people to continue to like fight this battle as it's going on. And it was very visceral. I felt like the hairs on my arms were standing up. It was like really crazy. We went up to the top of Little Round Top and couldn't see anything, but again, we had this guide who really visualized it for us. When my partner and I went, it was sunny, it was 95, and it was crawling with people because it's the summer. And we took a bus tour because I can only afford what I can afford. And it was a much different experience. Our guide was still very wonderful. He helped us visualize the whole thing. But he also was focused a lot while we were driving around on how the statues at Gettysburg were placed in all the memorials and telling us some stories about some of those folks. And it occurred to me that while the Battle of Gettysburg is an incredibly terrible, awful, and awesome moment in our history, which deserved all of my attention that day and certainly got it, the formation of memory around Gettysburg after the battle is a whole thing that I had never considered. And so when I came home, I went looking for books on that. And I kid you not, I'm currently reading a book called These Honor Dead, The Formation of American Memory at Gettysburg by Thomas Desjardins. That might not be how you say that, but it's literally about memory and Gettysburg. I'm not done with it yet. I don't want to pass any judgments on it yet. I definitely have some issue with writing style. I'm listening to the audiobook, but so far it has given me so much to chew on and has proved a perfect capstone to our trip. So it was a really great trip. I came home and the next day was when I dyed my hair red. So of course I have my normal hair color in all the photos, but that's fine because I look like a fire engine now and I love it. I hope that you have enjoyed this, a little bit of a life update on where I've been, and this was fun. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. Bye.